All simple minds think alike. Setting lines attract center location setting. The simplest terms is Occam razor. Directing lines of simplicity puts all lines of communication how you see yourself, your own handler. Directing ground centers into all levels into high core centers is the compliance setting location to its travel. Directing ground centers line lines at location systems puts you in a higher information setting of all communication setting out of the story frames that you put yourself in position. Your life is aligned communications that's tethered and attached to yourself, but you're in position location to recognize that, how to formulate and simulate that your set position location to its system. So you're in charge of your life. Your life is a constant, continuous flow that just keeps existing. Getting out of the time frames of everything collapses everything location attractions and understand you see yourself through a story. But a story never ends. And that puts you in positions for you guys to recognize these things in your seconds, minutes, and hours in frame. Now, in that line screen adaptation and setting and track communication systems, before we get started, Jenna is going to be on lines of time frame lines, off grid, but online with everybody. Keep you guys updated what's going on in that position location systems, okay? So in that tracks lines, in that position location setting, there's no Q&A in that positions today, in position of tomorrow and Friday. No school on Friday, but set position location school today and school tomorrow in tractions. That's already here in setting all through operation line and sequence. Setting communication setting is a truth lines and narrative. The process, your position location is how you start to rewrite everything that you already created. And that direct course centers lines of calculation to a system. Now, when you get rid of the creation, you come into new cycles of just creating in that position. The inner child is processing now that puts all communications with simulation at all levels what it already created. It's coming into new cycles of new games, of creating new line division, creating new lines of cycles, creating new line course centers of everything will travel in that communication lines and grounds. Let's operate the system. It lines its communication setting in that communication lines, changing all communication lines and reframing, retract visions, reset lines, communication lines, recalculate, modify, and clocking lines, screen adaptation, and flux. What you guys have to start to identify, everything around you is a continuous force of a life that is not in position of an end. It's a constant continuous of an internal to an external force that keeps you in a rotation spin in position of you just creating your life force, of just existing, evolving, and expanding yourselves with yourself and with each other. And you get out of stop mirroring yourselves and how you see everybody in perception, how you want to see them in a story frame. All that is leaving your system and taking it out of all communications back to zero into nothing of its system locations, coming into the simulation of its modulation of its game itself. Now, once you understand that, everything in lines of communication setting puts you in position locations, interactions of nothing. The nothing itself is just the existing of itself, is the imaginary setting which you always have been, is the balance, the energy, the existence of your networks. Now that puts all lines of all communications in balance, that gets you in communication setting of all levels of your life out of confusion. Okay? Understanding the interception connections of the mind, inception itself, is basically understanding how the brain converts and records everything in set lines of setting of seconds, minutes, and hours. Now, once you understand the correlation setting attractions to your 12 DNAs, everything will be back set to one number, shape, letter, and symbol. You traffic your inventory line screen adaptation setting, everything will start to disappear where it's supposed to be, the existence of nothing and the nothing of everything. That gets you in all communication setting into the conceptual setting of the mind interpretates everything that you see in set positions. All right? So you rewrite everything all over again in the mind and conception of the simulation. Okay? All right, everybody. Now we're just going to go through frame lines, directing ground centers lines of service. Now, Fridays attract locations where there's no school, and that lines of screen adaptation and system. So what I'm going to do with Thursday lines attract centers, you guys are going to have your security line defense. You're going to be 11 line cycles into your solar system attractions. Direct lines of 3 lines of flux and 4 lines of measure. All right. The scales of the communication extending to the clocking screen adaptation system, I will give to all communications of unison. You set it on signal. You guys will get your security line defense. All right. Remember, everything's in chronological order. Okay. Conversation is the best hand. It's the simplicity act and line communication setting that puts all communication lines of balance, how you see yourself in information system, how you calculate and modify, and that position location attractions. All right. So you stop mirroring yourself, how you see everybody and how you want to see. You start to recognize how you're going to master yourself and the game levels of you and the ascensions of its unifications of its awakening. All right? The awakening process is just the atmosphere line. It's the awakening process lines of its width line. In that position locations, all levels, the atmosphere changes the core centers into kaleidoscope acknowledging your intelligence of your networks in that position location of its grounds. Awakening. Now, getting into conceptual lines of ground, sound lines of service, process communication system, how we see your lines all communicates designing of angles. Triangulation lines, 4 triangle line rotations, height travels, endpoint lines of graph, and set position. Calculate and modify line direct signal, location Merkaba, tetrarch, and tetraregion. Star mix of time centers operates the signal location setting to our lines of volume. Center core centers, center attractions, lines of 3 lines of flux, 3 lines of measure and scale, and track communications. Okay? Common information lines, intelligence, information line and grounds. Calculate and modify the attractions. Center core centers, directing ground centers of surface and track communications. All right? High lines of switching, high lines of ground set positions. So once you guys get into the 12 DNA, the simulation of the core centers merges and scales of communication setting and ground slides of setting. The process of communication setting, you guys will be in the center core of everything in the set position. You'll be in the center set position of its galactic energy core. You'll be in the center of all operation, inside tractions. Inside traction is the interconnection setting to the mind inception itself. Get more clarity, more focus when you're in that position, location, and settings in that tractions. All right? The story frame itself is a storytelling line screen adaptation of self that travels the set core centers its operation into remembering you in travel and communication. Story. Storyline is sequence, lines of communication setting to understand what you're doing, and lines of communication and travels, direct lines of ground center locations, in your graphical streams, lines of 4-line signals and travel. Come into the simulation of your inner child, process communication setting of seconds, minutes, and hours that takes you out of track communications. Directing ground centers, pixelation lines, center communication setting, and lacing lines of communications of confusion. Line signals, grounds, graph line communication setting of the Schumann resonance and travel. Directing ground centers lines at set position locations comes into alpha, delta, and theta communication lines of travel communications. Directing ground centers high layers of service sets lines of wall sequence lines of grounds in that communication system, all through tractions. Brontosaurus. All right, so high core centers, dynamics lines, hydraulics, screen adaptation lines of high set position, all of the simulation grounds. The calculate and modify actually lives in the simulation itself. So the team will start to recognize what they're coring in the line communication setting, how to open up dimensional and simulation doors in set lines of sequence that puts panels of operation and lines of balance in set calculations. Ground centers are 45 line angles, 4 tractions, 4 divisions, 4 location settings. Crossing angles and point lines of graph in set travel communications. Okay? High signals, ceiling lines, rotational lines, and core centers, lines of track centers, and direction. Okay? All right. So in that process, you get out of story frame, 3 signals, lines of characters, 3 single lines of players, and 3 singularities, lines of communication to its grounds itself. Process lines of box frame, set core centers, and triangulation lines of flux over screen. Direct lines of home, directing ground centers of flux over line screen adaptation of the system, all through traction. Directing lines of pi, correlates to compass, correlates to sending to travel, directing ground centers to surface, set lines of operation lines of 1, set lines of communication lines of 3 measure and scale, and process communication. Directing ground centers high lines of service, change the communication lines of time, measure, and scale of communication. Sets calculation ground centers of surface and track communication and schematics over screen. Directing ground centers into line communication system, all through tractions. All right, set calculation lines, directing lines, Pisces lines, directing lines, 2 fishes and 1 bowl in track communications. To understand the intro line core centers in geometrics, sacred geometry, core centers, lines of travel. 2 fishes in 1 bottle. 2 fishes in 1 bowl. 2 fishes in 1 cycle. 2 fishes in 1 traction. 2 fishes in line calculation setting. Bring in line the signals, lines of 1, overline, cross line 2, line rotation line, coming into all communication setting, and track communications of yin and yang. Travels endpoint lines of graphs of balance. Set calculation lines of ground, center core system and travel, 3 signal lines of ground in line rotations of its earth that rotates its system in colossal. Track to its communication setting, travels in lines of simulation system, all through traction. Inside traction, right? So the interconnection setting comes in Aquarius, and it calculates the modified line core centers of Pisces. Directing lines to position location comes in Sagittarius. Sagittarius line screens adaptation to its moon that operates at city location setting to the astral travels, the actual connections, location setting that puts all of its pathology, directing lines and position locations, all calculated and modified to a pair of missing and line course centers that tracks its communication system of their travel. Paragraphing lines, course centers, lines of travel, paragraphs, high signal lines of ground set, course centers, anagrams, high lines, disassociation, operation line signals, ground centers, line communication setting, paragram, course centers, lines of travel, directing line length, line communications, configuration lines of code fragmentations, directing lines of link, defrags over screen, adaptation lines of signatures, ground lines of service, open line signal location setting, operating line communication setting, in the conversion system, to the brain communication lines of conversion, directing ground centers, lines of service, open lines of the cerebral, visual cortex, back in traction, back in the vision, back in cortex, back in calculation, the brain itself. Booyah. All done by equation. The brain itself. The brain itself in set tractions. And if you look really close, you can see the configuration of all faces in traction. All right, the operation sequence. Understand the configuration lines is 0, travels its point lines of graph. Now directing lines of link gets into all lines of streaming, longitude and latitude. The probation line course centers is position locations into high calculations. Center lines of graphs, center course centers, center operation, 3 centers of travel, and 3 grounds of surface and travel communications. Online centers, sets communication system, all through tractions. Okay? I-line screens, 4 box frames, 3 line signals, 3 grounds of surface attraction. Okay, box framing, triangulation line centers into its pyramid and astral projections, astral connections, the astrological, the geometric, the geological, and the geographical system of travel. Okay? High signals a solar sail, a dimensional line sail that sets open sequence of panels and set course centers of its moon. Process inline course centers, inline rotation system, travels its position location of yin and yang in communication of fish going this way and the fish going the opposite signals and locations of setting. Sets communication lines of ground lines of service, sets communication of yin and yang and set course centers of center operation and simulation of face facades. Triangulation line connection setting that opens up all communication setting of its computer adaptation line circuits and set travels in point lines of communication. All through traction, all through vision, all through balance. The high signal grounds sets graphical screens lines inside rotation surface and tractions. All through set calculations. Waving lines, central lines, electrical lines of grids, electrical lines of panels, simulation core. 4 panels of flush, and an evac line centers of travel. Right? Set calculation 1, outline 2, and 3. Calculation lines, AC line, setting lines to D. Set position D over X in question. Sets travels endpoint lines at 3 centers, 4 lines of measure. 7 calculations of ground lines of surface. Sets track location line connection setting and graphical screen lines adaptation, flicking the switch and bounds up communication. Course centers line to direct signals in a solar sail and line conditions of both directions and set lines of 3 track centers of past, present, and future. Calculate and modify line course centers has a configuration setting of tone. Directing ground centers highline sequence sets earth line, ground lines, and center communication setting that processes the panels in its primer circuits of 3 travels and track communications. High signal lines of grounds, high lines of position. Operation lines of its operator sets lines of navigation course offsetting. Process lines of 0, process lines of 12, and set lines of measure. 12 lines of signals of 11, line crosses lines of 2, 2 lines of 3, 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of scale, and 3 lines of locations equals lines of setting as 0, 1, operation lines of triangulation flux over screen. Directing ground centers of surface, open all communication setting, and configure a setting of 4 cycles of traction. Calculate and modify sets lines of solar track centers and direct signals in position to its solar systems and 3 triangulations of flux in a box frame and molecular design and 3 travels. Setting communication lines of an atom rotates a system of 12 line cycles, directing grounds into 3 lines of flux, 1 half pipe and 4 lines of measure, outline scale, and 3 ground centers of surface, 3 surface lines of powers, and 3 set calculated lines of 3, 6, and 9 of pattern to a part acceleration system of time, measure, and scale, and set communications in its setting of a simulation. Done by equation. Okay? All right. Calculate and modify in 3 lines of center of travel, all through track communications and part accelerations. Okay, so the formulas get a lot more complicated, a lot more confusing, but a lot more aligned. In line communicates and sent to your simulation lines, your box frames, that puts everything locates in the system all through track correlations. All right? Directing lines of 4 box frames and a triangulation setting in 3 lines of signals. Okay? Sets lines of signals, lines of 1, signal lines of line, position over across line condition, lines of 2 setting. Sets communication and triangulation up and triangulation 1, setter 1 indicates in system all through travel. All through directions, all through traction. All right? High signal lines of grounds, high lines of setting. Set position of 1, set position of 2. Pyramid line signal. Rotates the cycles of triangulation lines. It sets an operation service in location system and travel in that communication setting a point graphs in one portal communication. Sets calculation grounds, high lines of signals, 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of scale, 4 lines of signals into position of data board, correlates operation line signals into configuration system all through travel. Okay? All calculated modified inside rotation surface and traction. Done by equation. So I'm setting these things up. They're already set up in line positions all through rotation setting into the simulation. All right. So your 12 DNA course line, inline condition setting, conception lines, inhibitors sets the auxiliary. Now auxiliary inputs, the process lines of D factors over screen lines of E lines of 1. Sets calculation lines of 1 equals lines of 1. Time lines of setting into 1000 measure, 1000 scale, 1000 projector, and 1 set position of 1 projection. Sets calculation on 3 zeros in traction. Directing ground centers line position lines, we take the DX over cross screen, 3 lines of measure, 4 set lines of signals, 7 lines of scales, and 12 line centers in a clocking system of 0 gravity in traction. Calculate and modify directs lines into all space modulation screens. Sets calculation lines of 4 clockings of zeros and position of 3 scale and communications. Set calculations of ground lines, sets position and 3 centers in each line angle and set tractions. Start with that calculation, and then we clock this system in 3 centers and position of 2 measure into 1 set position of 0 gravity. Calculate and modify, we change the ground centers in an operation sequence and panel of operation set calculations. Time measure and scales, 3 signals lines of 1, set position of 0, 0, 0, alpha wave, delta, and theta, and 3 signals. 3 ground set lines of high center interference gravitation lines. Allocate time frame and 0 calculations. Sets communication of woven screens and time capacitor to set position location of a half pipe that outlines its calculation setting and inner circuits travel. Sets calculation ground centers of service, the operation system of its cloud, energize its system, location system, all through calculations. Done by equation. All right? All right, so it gets more complicated because we're coming to circuitry board lines into the motherboard. The motherboard sets lines of the surface line course centers and surface lines of tractions. 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of scale, 3 lines of balance. Position of 3, position of 3, position of 3, position of 3, position of 3. And set tractions and communications. All right? Directing lines of link, process inside outline rotation into water sequence, and ground centers of arrows of indicating system, all through tractions. All right? Set, calculate, and modify. Direct lines of north is now south, south is now north, east lines of west, west is lines of east, and travel communications. Directing lines of link, process calculates and green lines into the operation lines in a torical screen, directing lines of flux and torical interference as it travels at 3 lines of signals in position location in Merkaba and tetrahedron. Process calculates and ground centers operate the signals in the earth line and ground lines of surface and traction. Okay, high signal lines of grounds, set lines of 1, 2, triangulation lines, molecular design, molecular structure, and 1 atom that interfaces the intercore setting to its neutron. Direct lines of neurons and 3 signals into 1 atom surface and 3 triangulation and 4 centers in travel of solar sail. Look at that, disappearing traction. Okay, solar sail, right? So the inner ground becomes the outer ground. The outer ground becomes the inner ground. That's core lines of the simulation ground centers of a window sequence that puts its center core of center of set position locations that time frames your setting at 3 lines of signals in communication setting to attract communication setting of solar lines and direct signals as set position. All through traction, done by equation. All right, so the center of line centers comes in its galaxy shift lines of anomaly. And that position disappeared, and I'm going to show you again. So you come in the magnetic force that puts all communication in its galactic energy core in traction. Directing ground centers, high lines of service, process lines of A lines of C lines of B lines of C, line conditions, high positions, endorphins lines, calculation lines, directing lines, cerebral lines, visual cortex lines, physical cortex, line condition setting, calculate and modify, cerebral cortex, one critical line course centers of travel, direct lines of ground, center lines of setting, high lines of service, operation lines of sequence, simulation ground lines, brain conversion location setting, back and zero line communication, high center location, simulation lines of track interference, inventory lines of grounds, high line position, high lines of sequence, high lines of panel, high positional holes, bypassing heart rate and time lines, time reactor line course centers, and zero gravity communication setting in high course centers of no resistance, line positional hole, back contractions, back in division, back location, back calculation line, bypassing location, triangulation line, resets, location setting, refix line centers, line condition setting, operation line signals, calculate and modify line course center and cerebral cortex lines, directing ground centers, high signature lines of 007, process lines of general line course centers, back in setting, back in operation line sequence, center operation lines of sequence location setting, and 4 lines of flux over 3, center communication lines of simulation grounds, and 7 lines of travel. Done by equation. All through conversion and traction. All done. All done in set position locations. All done in set position locations. Out of story, out of frame, out of traction. Okay, so this is the actual matrix that's going bye-bye, that you all created through a story frame. And you look at the traction centers, you can see all the files in that communication setting all through traction. That's a lot of files of indication setting all through conversions, guys. Hoo-ah. So that's one factor, one screen, one adaptation setting that's going to release panels in all set position. Set you free and truth lines into your narratives of no story of frame of anything. Comes in all communication setting and set tractions. Okay? All right, so the defrags sets course centers in sectors, vectors, and quads. The quadrant line centers has a QR code. Line centers are computer line centers in XYJ. Calculation lines are high lines and one line screen. C lines is setting. H lines of traction and set calculations. Setting C lines into C line rotations, Z line rotations, Z line traction, and Z line directions. 0 lines of gravity, 0 lines of program, 0 lines of projection over projections of track communications. That's my equation. All right. So all this is all formula equations. So that's just re-angle points to line screen adaptations, process your center operation line signals into ground lines of surface, balance line condition setting, and process communications all through grounds, powers, and atmospheres. 3 signal lines of grounds, earth lines of 1, earth lines of 2, earth lines of 3, metric meters and scale, DNA track location 12 DNA. Sets calculation ground centers, influx over lines of earth lines of center, earth lines of surface, earth lines setting. Process indicates setting, 12 lines of measure, 12 lines of scale. Transits lines, equal line course centers. Change communicates lines of time, measure, and scale. 3 lines of 4 settings of pattern. Process indicates an overline cross line angles inside communication setting, all through flux and travel. Done by equation. All right, so it's already set in calculations. Realigning the adjustment line screen sets the pixelation graphs and box frames. Survey box frame and a course line. Now, wherever we're going to position locations to get you guys in black and white, process yin and yang, process lines 0, take out the black and white, line course centers, triangulate the flux, change the pixelation graph, line lacing, line communication, overriding sequence, overline a panel, process in that position location system, all through TV receptor. Directing ground centers, high center line condition setting, process and pixelation graphs in a 3-line measure, 4 scales in direct lines of timeline, measure, and scale that operates the signal location setting to a D-force, calculate modified ground centers and a T-reception line that crosses all angles of perception through pi and track communications. Done by equation. All right? All right, taking outline loops, course centers of quantum interference, quantum change, direct lines and quantum lines of question, outline signals, and ground communication of surface interactions. All right, directing course in 3 lines of signals and ground calculations. All right, there's a matrix. Setting sequence out the equation. Done by equation. Done. Oh, disappeared, right? There it is. Gone, right? Setting sequence on white. Setting course off 1. Setting course off 2. Triangulation line position. Reset calculation lines. Out of story frame. Out of traction. Out of division. Center lines. Set traction. In the mitigation lines. In position out of dark into light. To the metric course centers of direct lines of no existing in panel. Process in position back in light. The center course center is a communication lines of graph and center operation. Okay, all through tractions, all right? Pixelation graph, errors of indication setting in travel. Okay, so we take 2,000 lines, position 25, sets equal lines to 0. 3 lines of 0, 0, 0, process lines of 2, process lines of 1, process lines of signals, pure and activation lines of screen adaptation. Elixir, cosmic flame, cosmic line setters of travel. 3 indicates lines of 1, process lines of 2, pyramid activation line rotations, 2 signals, 0 gravity, 2 set lines, and 5 set lines of travel. Calculate and modify, directing lines of graph, and center communicates the setting of flux over screen. Directing ground centers of service, process lines of 2 over lines of setting, 2 lines of track centers, 5 lines of measure, and scale communicates the setting, road graph. Directing ground centers in lines of tubing, direct centers and constellation system, all through light bulbs, attract communication of intelligence. Formulate the ground centers of service, 3 lines of angles, 3 lines of travel, 3 line communication, 3 calculate and modify, setting lines of 3, 6 over line, 6 over 9, 9 line centers, pyramid activation line, crown lines, correlation setting, simulation core, 4 line signals of travel in that communication setting to surface. Down by equation. See intelligence of frame. Outline signal and configuration system all through travel. Simulation itself, see? And set tractions. Hooah! Down by equation. All right, so the pyramid activation line rotates the correlation setting of time. The time lines of centers of core lines of track center interference. Sets lines of 20 meters. Setting core centers of 8 tractions. In position of 26 over line. 26 line centers. Equal lines equations. We go through question, mark, over line equals lines of 7 travel. Okay, directing lines of 7 over 8 over question. Time lines of centers in the electrical line communication setting into a 60-watt bulb and 3 centers of signals in a 4-graph communication setting and 3 signal lines of grounds of set traction. Done my equation. All right, 20 lines of seconds over lines of meters has a 24,000 line scale. Directing lines position 24 lines into 144 flux. 24 lines of flux, 144 flux. Set lines and set positional levels of 3 zeros. 3 calculations and 3 settings. Set position 144 in position 1, 2, and 3 zeros. In position lines in line condition north, east, west, and south. Directing lines in line position all levels. Directing lines of space and time. Set track location of 3 lines of 4 at signal into 1 ground service and center core system of direct and redirect in set position of 45 flux. Calculate and modify travels point lines of graph and 24 line cycles of 3, set calculation lines of 6 over 9 line sequence of 12 and a 24 clocking system of pi generation line calculation setting into the simulation core and set track communications. Done by equation. Okay. So I know everybody's a lot more confused now, but this is going to get a lot more easier for you guys to regenerate, resource, recalculate, remodify, retriangulate, recalculate inline centers all through information setting in that position locations, taking you out of everything of story and put you in everything of telling lines of story. Self travels operation into readjusting your system of view and traction. Sets calculation grounds, high lines of setting and sequence. Now we come into communication setting and configuration setting that travels its point lines of graph. Okay, the center lines have 4 box frames into 1 direction system and 4 calculations ground centers of surface. 2 lines of measure, triangulations of 3, triangulations of 4, triangulations of 7, set lines of 12, 24 scales of communication setting. Pixelation graphs and TV line, 4 signals of 3 inside rotations, and lacing lines at 4 signals of grounds sets the operating system location setting to a TV reception line of 0 gravity, 0 calculation as 0, 1 in frame position location and calculation. Sets calculation lines of 1 center, 1 traction, 4 lines of signals, 4 lines of 7, sets lines of 12 line position of 24 clocking center, 0 gravity, calculated lines of simulation system into recourse and source of records and time frames existing and involving all at once in traction. Done by equation. All right. Setting lines, near lines, course centers of 3 travels, line centers of 3 calculations, 3 communication setting, triangulation lines of 1 equal lines of question, set calculation of screen. Directing lines of 3 grounds, equal lines of course centers, north, east, west, and south in travel. Calculate and modify in pyramid erode grass screens adaptation. Calculating ground centers, high signals, overline signal, over cross location, laser track centers into an operation sequence that grounds the system at 3 lines of measure in a pyramid activation line and existing in form. Sets calculation laser lines, high line signals, location system, all through travel. Platforms E factors, line condition setting, a pyramid activation line screen adaptations, and travel communication of its grounds of its surface. Laser track centers, open line panels, process its position location to its Skynet that opens all signify and screen adaptations. Process lines and indication lines, a location grid that opens all signals, opens all grounds, open all centers, and sonar of interference of echo chambers and screen. Directing ground centers high set coordination system in travels inline communication setting that puts all communication system all through traction and position. Added resistance of everything. Set core centers of center, set position of 3, set position of 4, set position of 7, and travel in position of constellation. The activation line core centers sets position of 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division. Past, present, and future, center core centers, out of story, out of frame, out of traction, out of division, out of locations, in position of center core center, in line conditions on standby, and 12 DNA tractions and set calculations in the simulation. Disappeared, right? You're not allowed to see it. Center core centers of travel, direct lines of grounds, set core centers in positional levels, kaleidoscope, line condition setting, Papa uniform, directing wheels and force of direction of time center that operates the signal location system, all through tractions. Done by equation. High signal lines of grounds, high lines of service at positional level. Your time reacted. Oh, time reacted. Center core inside communication system and travel. Okay, we're done by equation. That's it. It's all done. Oh yeah. So you're all going to see it in signal. You're all going to see it in balance. You're all going to see it in travel. You're going to see it in all communication system and calculation settings. All right. So remember, there's no Q&A in line communication setting and that tractions and that positional case to systems. Have a wonderful day. Adios.